Welcome back to my channel, everybody. I am excited to introduce you to part 2 of my Viking outfit that I made. This was made for a SCA event where I ran around incognito in some Viking clothing since I don't often wear this style. I think this is the first full outfit I've ever made for myself. And I would love to take you through the process of how I make this really cute Viking Age apron dress based on some finds from Birka. It's going to start with mapping out the pattern that I've kind of gridded out on some twill wool. So it's a 2-2 twill in sort of a cream color and a dark chocolate. And it creates a really fun sort of pin effect or bird eye effect. I didn't really make a paper pattern for this because it's a bunch of geometric shapes that were pretty easy to lay out with a straight ruler and some chalk, just connecting a couple of key dots from the sketch I graded up for my size. I didn't really make a video for that because it was just me sketching out some key measurements. The big one I was looking for was sort of under my arm to my natural waist and trying to divide the widest part of my torso between the 4 different panels. So you can do a little bit of adjustments in math to figure out how that works. And then dividing up the pattern so that I hopefully don't waste much fabric. So it's a really cool project, and there's so little waste when you're constructing in this method that it's really so very different from how we construct things today. To save myself a little bit of time, I did fold the fabric in half so that I could cut some of the stuff doubled over. That includes one front panel and one back panel that were cut on the fold. And then I used the salvage edge to create these side panels. Depending on how wide you make the body portion of the side panels, you might actually be able to do more volume in your skirt. Once I got the fabric down to a single set of these panels, I did decide to move it to the cutting table and start cutting things out rather than rolling around on the floor. It just made my life a little bit easier. So if you're having to roll around on the floor, I feel you. And I hope that you get your large pieces cut out first, and then you can start to transition some of the smaller pieces or more easily managed bits back onto a table. I added just a little bit of curve to the bottom portions of these panels. So right around the hem, I figured out a couple inches up would create a smile from the bottom of the panel I'd cut versus the cutting line I ended up adding. So I wanted to add just a little bit of a curve to help it drape around myself a little bit easier. And then I drew a straight line to continue the diagonal from that point back up into the side that I'd already cut out. Once I completed it for this panel, I then go back and add that same smile to all of my other skirt panels to make sure it's staying pretty consistent and I have an even hem, and the same treatment on each of these corners. And try on round 2, technically. I put the whole thing on for the first try on and it ended up being a bit too big. So I decided after looking around a bit that I needed to go and sew up some of the side seams just a bit more. I think I took an extra ½ inch out on all 4 seams, which brought about an inch out per seam, made it way easier. And after I got all of those seams stitched, because I'm going to do seam treatments on this, I needed to unpick all of the extra stitching I had through the bodice. I did kind of grade out that bit back into the skirt because I wanted to keep the fullness in the skirt that I had. I just wanted it to fit a little bit better around my torso. If this video is being helpful to you, I would really love it if you would give it a thumbs up. That way, other folks in the algorithm can see that you're enjoying it, and other people making Viking apron dresses might be able to find it and get some extra help. Anyway, thank you so much for watching, and as I pull up all of the threads that are left in that seam with this really cool little end of my seam ripper, let's start talking about the next phase of my sewing project, which is really fun. In the book Woven into the Earth, they have a really awesome seam treatment for wool garments. And it's going to involve putting down a woolen yarn over the cut edges of a wool piece of fabric and basically whip stitching it down. I just thought it was so cool that I had to try it on some of the previous ones that I've made for other people. And I loved the effect. I loved how light and easily finished that seam gets, and it really does just start to map together with wear and use. So I wanted to do the same thing to my hanger-rock or apron dress. So I started just laying this 100% wool yarn down that I'd picked up at a swap meet of some sort. And it creates these really fun little stitches outside. Now, back to what I said in my previous video, some of my friends who know way more about Viking clothing than I do suggested that most of the stitches seen on the outside of this kind of a garment would probably have been like 90% functional, which is exactly what this is doing. It's a contrasting color. It's going to add a little bit of pop once you start seeing the yellow stitches on the outside. But ultimately, it's serving a function to finish that raw edge inside the garment so that it doesn't fray or do something weird. If you'd like to help support the channel in a more monetary way, there are going to be affiliate links for Woven into the Earth and some of the other more Viking Age clothing books I've used as references throughout this project down in the description, so feel free to check those out as well when you've got a minute. But just for the record, it's no pressure to check those out at all. I love the fact that you are all just watching this video, so thank you for watching. One thing I did make a conscious choice about when I started stitching down the wool yarn was to use a slightly wider hole in my needle eye to make it a bit easier for me to pull the yarn through the wool fabric. The wool yarn that's being laid down, that cream color, is actually just a regular worsted weight knitting wool. So it's actually a little bit thicker and fluffier than some of the ones I've worked with in the past, which means it's going to mat and kind of knit together with the fibers on that raw edge really, really well. But at the same time, it was a little bit difficult trying to get the over thread, the working thread, around it with a narrow needle. So using the wider one helped get that through just a little bit easier and provided a wider hole so that the doubled over bit by the eye actually had room to maneuver through. The historical reproduction needles that I have are actually pretty close to that too. So it made for a much more consistent experience going through this to use just a larger eyed embroidery needle if you're trying to do this project yourself. I also, if you notice on the back side that's already worked, decided to make a choice and stitch down the salvage edge in a very similar way to make the outside look more symmetrical and even. It just made my little heart happy, so hopefully that whole thing makes sense to you too. From a practical standpoint, by stitching down that salvage edge, I was able to get a little bit less movement inside the garment, so things will lay nicer and not bunch up oddly. And if I had to cut it off, I would have been doing the same seam treatment on the other side anyway. So by skipping that step, I could theoretically let this garment out if I needed to in the future. I do have to say, it was way easier to stitch just the salvage edge down than it was to go through and get the wool yarn worked into place. If you can't tell from the rate of my speed here, it was just less stuff to try and manage. The wool yarn is totally a doable little side project, but it was way easier just when I was stitching salvages. And once I got through doing all of those salvage edges, which did take quite a bit of time for the 4 seams, I then had to start doing the hems. And I hemmed both the neck facing top side of the apron dress and the bottom edge using that same situation. I didn't do a rolled hem because I was worried it would add bulk. And I thought the yellow stitches along the hem would help create a more consistent look to the whole garment. It's like sometimes the aesthetic from the period was created for a practical purpose. The hardest part about doing the hems was probably trying to get through the multiple layers of the doubled over hem bits and make sure everything was getting encased by that yarn. Honestly, this particular section is part of why I was worried about choosing a wider yarn rather than a narrower one, because it gave me a little bit of extra room to get the yarn worked into this section of the seam and make sure everything would be stuck together and start matting together really nicely as the fibers got through it. Deciding what to do with the tails of the yarn actually ended up being one of the more interesting bits of this. So it ends up lapping over in one small section of my dress. And it's just because I got to the end of the hem and needed to go back through. But the overall effect of trying to get the hem sewn in does create this really cool look. It's almost like tiny little seeds on top of my tiny little seed patterned fabric. But to get the wool threads to line up together, I just laid the 2 inches of extra overlap over the previously whip stitched hem and tried to mimic those stitches. And where I couldn't mimic the stitches, I just went through the strand of wool yarn I'd already laid down. That way I wouldn't have extra stitches showing out on the fabric. This got the fibers all lined up together and helped again to avoid extra bulk in those seams. Whether it was around my neckline or the hem, bulk wouldn't have really done me a lot of good in either place. I didn't really worry as much about that last little bit of the wool yarn kind of sitting out as a tuft, knowing that with wear and age it's going to get worked together with the rest of the fibers. And I also decided I was going to do a modern dressmaker's knot and bury my thread inside my hem. It's maybe not the way they did it back at that point, but it's a really comfortable method of finishing off a seam for me. So that's what I did. The knot didn't really add any extra bulk beyond what the yarn was already adding in that area. With the seams all finished and filled in, it was actually a really good fit on the dress. And time to start to figure out where to put the loops I was going to use to hang my dress from using my turtle brooches and the straps. So I decided that I was going to go just roughly sort of mid-bust point, or just outside of those for the outer edge of the loops, so that by the time the loops went over and came into the neckline, it should sit mid-bust point. I'm doing this into the camera not only to show you what's going on, but to take a look at the fit and get the placement right. To make the little loops that I'm going to use to hang the dress from in the front, I'm just going to cut a couple of 2-inch wide strips from a leftover piece of the fabric. And they don't have to be especially long. Honestly, the ones I made might be a little bit too long too. Because I don't make the style very often, it's one of those things I just don't often think about. The reason I wanted to do little loops instead of just pinning my turtle brooches directly into the dress itself was to try and save them from getting caught on burrs in the middle, or from getting extra wear that's really not necessary. There's some other reenactors that think that this might have been a valid way of doing it, and I'm basing my work sort of on what they've been looking at and working on for much longer periods of time than I have. Now, to create the tube, I could just sew a tube and turn it right side out, but I really don't want to have to turn something quite that narrow. So I think it would be way easier on something like this to just fold all the raw edges in and whip stitch over the edge. This is what I ended up doing for the loops as well as for the longer straps that go along the back. First, I'm going to go through and pin everything so that it all stays even and doesn't start to roll around, because when this wool isn't being pressed, it does kind of like to puff up a bit, which makes it fluffy and warm, but also means that it's going to need a little bit of extra care if I'm not going to bust out the iron. To start my whip stitch, I buried the knot on the inside and then did one more overhead knot at the end. This helps to make sure that my stitches stay secure and it holds those ends together while I start doing some whip stitches over the sides to keep everything together. And then I just follow this process going through both sides of that seam and pulling my thread through all the way down. Process got to be a little bit fiddly, but I really loved that I was able to incorporate the yellow stitches I had used on the body of the dress for construction into the straps as well, to kind of make that color carry over as a design choice. And it just seemed like a really practical way to finish this. There were some people I was talking to that suggested this might have been tablet woven or narrow wares in general, because that was a really popular method of trimming things, but I didn't really make the time to do anything like that for this quick project. So whip stitching it is. Now I'm going to go ahead and take the loops and sort of pin and center them just inside of where I put those pins. And these are going to be worked inside the garment. That way I can hide the edge and still have a really nice outward facing garment, and do a little bit of overstitching and whip stitching into that piece of wool yarn I used to hem everything. Again, to try and get the raw edges of my loop to mat together with the wool and keep everything from fraying out on me. Now, it's probably a much bigger issue with some of the more modern wools, is what I've heard. In general, no one wants their garments to fray out when they've been working so hard on them. Once the loops are all pinned in place and ready to be sewn, I am going to put them side by side just to compare the size and the height and make sure that was symmetrical on each side of my body. With those loops sewn into place, I'm then going to start working on the longer strip that is going to eventually become my shoulder straps. Those shoulder straps needed to be quite a bit longer, but ultimately I might not have needed to piece them, frankly. So I am piecing them because I wanted to make sure I had enough fabric, because it's a lot easier to take some of this fabric out of my shoulder straps and make them shorter than it is to have to go back and add that stuff later. So I'm just doing a knot, a running stitch, and a knot to get the strips pieced together, because these are then going to be folded in on themselves once I get everything pieced and treated the same way as the initial loops were, where raw edges go inside and then I whip stitch along the edge for some additional strength. Again, since I'm using that wider wool thread, I am using a wider needle to help me work it through. It was a little bit more finicky and fighty on the shoulder straps than it had been on some other parts. The longer seam stitches of the dress I did sew on a machine, so I didn't have to fight with that nearly as much. But just like before, we're going to fold all of those raw edges in. And from there, we're going to start whip stitching our shoulder straps together. Have you done these loop shoulder straps on your Viking apron dresses if you've made one of these before? If you have, tell me how you like them down in the comment section, or do you prefer just to have a straight woven band of tablet weaving, or maybe a piece of the fabric that is just a bit wider instead of something that loops over? I'd love to hear some other people's opinions on these dresses, what their preferences were, all of that stuff down in the comments. The twill weave on this wool does make it quite a bit springier than what I was contemplating using. So that does mean I need to go through and add these extra pins. It just fought me less once I started doing that, and in a couple spots I realized I needed more. Remember how I was saying that my straps might be just a little bit too long? Well, it was a bit too long, and ironically, it's a bit too long by almost exactly the amount of fabric I added onto each side. But I really love this looped over effect for my apron dress. I think it adds just a little bit of something different, but at the same time being plausible. My one less than 100% functional piece of embellishment that I added to this is going to be a herringbone stitch that goes over the seams of my finished garment. And this is going to be done with a really gorgeous sort of rust-colored Icelandic wool that one of my friends brought back from Iceland and gifted me at 12th night this year. So thank you so much for the wool. I tried to put it to great use. This thread, because it's hand spun, ends up being a little uneven in some spots where it's thinner or thicker, but overall it's actually really consistent. So I thought it would be really great for this. A herringbone stitch in modern tailoring can be used to tack down different bits of a facing or a hemline. And I've seen some reenactors use it as not only a way of trying to keep some of their hems flat, but as a decorative piece. So the way this generally works is you're working towards yourself and your stitches are going to go up and away from you, and then you'll pull them back and diagonally across the seam or the raw edge you're trying to tack down. I do this over all of the finish seams, not really because they needed that extra finishing, to try and keep them flat as well as make it a little bit more decorative because I'm extra and I wanted some extra decoration on this. It is being worn with a red tunic, but it just needed more color for me and my personal taste. So your mileage and use may vary. I did try and keep my embroidery to a smaller amount, but I thought that this just added the extra pop of color I really wanted. The herringbone stitches do just go down the longer seams of the finished dress. They're not going to go around the neckline because I didn't quite have enough of the yellow to create a second band of those stitches. And for me at least, it kind of looked weird on the sampler I tried where it was just the herringbone sitting underneath a single layer of those yellow stitches, when the rest of the dress would have the yellow stitches going on both sides of the herringbone. As I worked down the length of the garment, it got a little bit more difficult to make sure I was keeping completely even tension. So every once in a while, you just gotta stop and pet your fabric and admire it and make sure the tension stays even. But once it was done, here's what I was trying to explain with the shoulder straps. I'm going to take these exquisite turtle brooches that I'd purchased ages ago, and they've got a little lever pin on the back. So the base of that pivot point is going to go through the small loop in front of my apron dress. And I'm going to hold that in place, and the longer loop of my shoulder strap is going to go over the top, and I'll close the pin. So for this particular style of dress, you really do need some sort of pins unless you're going to sew your straps in place. It does appear from the archaeological evidence I've seen that this is how the dress was most commonly worn, but those brooches were going to be specific to a region. So I think these might have been from Birka or from Northern Ireland. I'd have to go and double check. It's been a while since I purchased them for doing this sort of a project at some point. But all in all, that's a completed dress. What do you think? I had so much fun making this dress and getting to run around in it and trying a slightly different spin. The skirts aren't quite as full as my normal 16th century Italian ones, so it didn't have quite the same spin and swoosh factor. But it is definitely a cute and workable little dress. I paired this with some shoes from a local reenactment company and some wool stockings that I already have from my medieval kit, a ankle woven belt, and some strung beads that I'd been gifted or purchased over the years. If you want a tutorial on how I did my hair for this or that head wrap, I would be happy to do that. Just let me know. And if this video has been helpful or informative, I would love to hear about it down in the comments. Like it if you found my little embroidery seam construction tidbits helpful. And I hope you have a fantastic day. Thank you so much for watching and sharing. And we will see you in the next round of sewing adventures around here. Bye, everyone.